at 7 a.m. Boston time. Happy to be here and tell you about some of the work that we've been doing in my lab, mainly over the past few years and stretching back maybe to around 15 years on the theme of adaptive constructive processes in memory, imagination, and creativity. And I think any talk that focuses on or includes in the title constructive processes has really got to, at some point, one has to tip one's hat to Bartlett. So I do that when I focus in my talk on constructive processes, because this is really where the notion of construction in cognitive psychology, at least, really begins. And so we all know Bartlett's famous 1932 book on remembering had people read stories, later on found that they didn't recall them exactly as they happened, but rather introduced various kinds of informative distortions, leading them to conclude that the first notion to get rid of is that memory is primarily or literally reduplicative or reproductive. In a world of constantly changing environment, literal recall is extraordinarily unimportant. Memory appears to be an affair of construction rather than reproduction. And one question that has interested me really for the last at least 25 years, and it's something that Bartlett hints at in his statement here, some of the concluding statements from his book, has to do with the functions of a constructive memory. What functions are served by having a constructive rather than a rotor reproductive memory system? We know what some of the downsides are. We're prone to errors, remembering things differently from the way they happen. This can have highly problematic consequences in certain domains we're all familiar with, such as eyewitness memory, when eyewitnesses misidentify people based on distorted memory, remember events differently from the way they happen. So is there any function to having a primarily constructive rather than a rotor reproductive memory system? We just lay down everything exactly the way it occurred and remembered it exactly as it occurred, then we could eliminate some problems caused by faulty memories. And I've taken this question on in a few different places. Initially, really, for me, would be in the 7 Sins of Memory. Moshe alluded to the original publication back in 2001, where I enumerated 7 different ways in which memory could go awry. But then importantly, at the end of the book, I tried to tell an adaptive story about some of the functions that are served by processes that also produce these 7 sins. In 2011, Scott Guerin, Peggy St. Jacques, and I kind of try to fill out some of these ideas specifically on memory distortion. And we were starting to see some evidence grow in favor of this perspective, which I have to say in the 2001 7 Sins of Memory is really based on argument, theory, and a little bit of evidence. But by 2011, we were starting to see an accumulation of more evidence on the functions of a constructive memory system. And most recently, Moshe alluded to this 20th anniversary edition. They gave me a nice, colorful cover. It was published a few months ago. And the way I handled this was not trying to totally rewrite the book, but for each of the 7 sins and for this adaptive perspectives chapter at the end, talk about 2 developments that I thought were interesting or noteworthy over the last 20 years. And again, we start to see, and I summarize very briefly in this book, some of the evidence that is pointing towards functions of constructive memory system, specifically functions of memory distortions. So historically, really the main function that people have talked about, and we see this going all the way back to Bartlett, is that we have a constructive memory because it helps to promote retention of the meaning and general themes of experiences. So the typical idea here would be that we typically don't need to remember every detail of every experience. Sometimes we're better off remembering the gist. Our minds would be cluttered if we had a rotor reproductive memory system. Therefore, we're good at taking away kind of the general meaning, the gist. But when we do that, when we remember the meaning and we don't remember details or remember gist without remembering details, then we're prone to certain kinds of well-known memory distortions. Today, I'm going to be focusing on a different idea, but it falls under the general rubric of what I've referred to as adaptive constructive processes. And these are processes that play a functional role in memory and cognition, but produce distortions, errors, illusions as a consequence of doing their cognitive job. So gist-based retention would be an example of that. What I will be talking about today, however, is a process I'll refer to as flexible episodic recombination. The capacity to take bits and pieces of past experience and rearrange them into novel representations that we can use in a variety of ways. But I'll also argue and show you some evidence at the end of the talk that this process, which can be useful for a number of cognitive functions, can also produce memory errors. And I'll be talking about flexible episodic recombination with respect to imagining future experiences and divergent creative thinking, two related adaptive processes that I think draw on this ability for flexible recombination, which again, as we'll see at the end of the talk, can also result in certain interesting kinds of memory errors. Okay, so imagining future experiences. This is a line of work that began in my lab, at least back in 2007. It's something I had been interested in prior to that, but had never really gotten around to doing experimental work on. And then when Donna Addis, shown in the picture here, showed up in my lab as a postdoc, she'd been doing some work on fMRI of autobiographical memory, and we talked about extending some of those autobiographical memory paradigms from the scanner to the domain of future imagination, and came up with this very straightforward past-future fMRI paradigm. This is illustrated in a cartoon from a review paper in Nature Reviews Neuroscience that we published in 2007. And what happens here, some of you may be familiar with this work already, but I'll review it for those who are not. People are put in the scanner, they're given a cue word, and then they're asked to either remember past experience during, say, the past few years related to that cue word. So, for example, in the thought bubble on the left, the participant here is thinking, I remember taking a day trip last summer and walking on the beach. That would be the memory part of the paradigm, or they might be, and the cue word for that might be vacation, or they might be given a cue word such as dog and asked to imagine a related event that could plausibly occur to them in the next few months or next few years involving a dog. And here in the thought bubble, the participant is imagining picking out a puppy at the pet shop next year in response to such a cue word. They're doing this silently in the scanner. We get the protocols post-scan of what they were actually imagining. And in addition to these two experimental tasks, they also perform a couple of control tasks that involve semantic and visuospatial processing in response to the same kinds of cue words, but don't require imagining or remembering a personal episode. And the sort of the number of interesting findings from the study, but I'm just going to show you the main one, which was the striking similarity that was observed when people remembered past events and imagined future events compared to those control tasks that I just mentioned. Here you see prominently the midline structures, medial prefrontal cortex, and then posterior, we see posterior cingulate, retrosplenial cortex, showing the very strikingly similar increase in activity when people remembered past events, imagined future events compared to controls, the control condition. There were other similarities as well, including activations in medial temporal lobe, hippocampus, lateral temporal, and lateral parietal regions, including the angular gyrus. So based on those results and one or two other studies that came out around the same time, one from Kathleen McDermott's lab, came out the same time as ours, and there was an earlier PET study that had shown roughly similar results. We postulated the existence of what we refer to as a core network that's involved in remembering past events, imagining future events, and supporting related kinds of mental simulations. This is from that Nature Reviews article with Addis and Randy Buckner. And you can see the core network displayed here, which is for all intents and purposes roughly equivalent to the default network, default mode network. They're almost the same thing, including those midline regions, medial temporal lobe, lateral parietal cortex, lateral temporal cortex. Those, the map that I just showed you is really based on just 2 or 3 studies, but after 2007, work in this area accelerated, and by 2015, there were quite a few studies that had looked at episodic simulation, imagining future events or other kinds of imagined events, and episodic memory, remembering past events. And Roland Benoit in my lab at that time led a postdoc, as a postdoc, led a meta-analysis, and we were able to confirm the existence of this core network jointly involved in remembering past events and imagining future events on the basis of a much larger sample of studies. That the neuroimaging data weren't the only similarities that we and others observed between remembering past and imagining future events. There are data from amnesic patients that show that many, not all, but most amnesic patients who have been tested, even up till this day, I would say, do have difficulties imagining their personal futures, imagining novel scenes in the scene construction work from Eleanor McGuire and Demis Hassabis. There are some amnesic patients who don't show these deficits. Larry Squire's lab has published a couple of papers on those, but I have to say the vast majority in the literature do. Older adults, we and others have published both behavioral and neuroimaging data showing a striking similarity in the reduction of episodic details in older adults, healthy older adults, and patients with Alzheimer's disease when they remember past events and imagine future events. And there are other similarities reviewed in the Current Opinion 2017 paper and the 2012 Neuron paper cited on the slide. But based on the evidence that we had, even back in 2007, Addis and I tried to make a link between some of these observations on future imagining and constructive memory, and building on some of the earlier ideas of Endel Tulving about the involvement of episodic memory in imagining the future, we suggested that episodic retrieval, that traditionally mostly associated with recollection of past personal experiences, also plays a key role in imagining or simulating possible future scenarios. And it does so, we suggested, by supporting the flexible retrieval and recombination of elements of stored episodes to construct possible future episodes. In other words, the way we were approaching it was that we're drawing on episodic retrieval here to use it in a very flexible way to imagine novel future events. And this is really what I have in mind when I refer to the process of flexible episodic recombination. We think it's adaptive when we're trying to use this process for purposes of simulating future events, because the future is rarely identical to the past. We need to be able to simulate novel upcoming situations we may never have encountered based on past experience. We can rely to some extent on pre-established schemas to do that job, and schemas and semantic memory no doubt play an important role in simulating the future. But to prepare for totally novel situations, we argued that this flexible episodic recombination process is also important and underlies some of the similarities that I just showed you. But now just completing the loop back to memory distortion, we also argued, even back in 2007, that this episodic recombination can result in memory errors when elements of past experiences are miscombined. So if we have a memory system that's set up to allow us to flexibly recombine bits and pieces of the past to simulate novel upcoming situations, that's a good thing. but we also suggest it can be the source of memory errors. And I'm going to get back to that at the end of the talk and show you some recent evidence on that point. So for the remainder of the talk, I'll first talk about mechanisms of episodic recombination and simulation as they apply to future imagining, and I'll say a few words about divergent creative thinking. And then I'll talk about episodic recombination and memory errors. All right, so let's focus on mechanisms. Our approach in the last few years to this question of how to document the involvement of episodic retrieval or characterize the mechanisms has been to try to manipulate the involvement of episodic retrieval in imagination tasks that we wouldn't typically refer to in the literature as episodic memory tasks. And we've used two different kinds of manipulation. First, what we call an episodic specificity induction, and second, the technique that probably most of you are familiar with of transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. So let's first talk about the episodic specificity induction, or ESI work. And a lot of this work was initiated in my lab, led by a couple of graduate students when they were with me, Kevin Medor and Helen Jing, shown in those photos. What is episodic specificity induction? Well, I would define it as a brief training in recollecting details of past experiences. And for this induction, we adapted a well-known procedure from cognitive psychology, been around for quite a while. It was initially developed by Ron Fisher and Ed Geiselman back in the 80s and 90s as a forensic protocol that's been used to increase episodic retrieval in eyewitnesses. So the cognitive interview is a structured protocol to try to get you to unpack your memory for a recent event in as much episodic detail as possible. And we had adapted it and changed it in various ways to suit our purposes. So it's an adapted version of the cognitive interview. We're not so much interested in what you remember about a recent past event. We're interested in the effects of detailed episodic retrieval on subsequent tasks, on downstream tasks that we give you to perform. And the logic is that by using this ESI to activate or bias episodic retrieval processes, the ESI should have selective downstream consequences, boosting performance on subsequent tasks that draw on episodic retrieval, such as future imagining, because you've just gotten these detailed episodic retrieval processes active and going. But it should have little or no effect on subsequent tasks that don't draw on episodic retrieval, such as, for example, describing a picture. So we use this as sort of a tool in order to separate out those processes that we think draw specifically on episodic retrieval and other processes that might impact, for example, future imagining, but don't draw on episodic retrieval. So let's take a look at these inductions. In these experiments, typically what happens is that people first view a video of people carrying out routine activities in a kitchen. It could be a video of anything, really, but we had some videos in the lab that had been used in other experiments of people carrying out a variety of activities in a kitchen. So you see this video, that's the event. And now with the ESI, we're going to try to get you to remember in as much episodic detail what happened in that event as we can. So this would just be an excerpt. I want you to close your eyes, get a picture in your head about the people in the video you saw, to think about what they look like, what they're wearing. Once you have a really good picture, I want you to tell me everything you remember about the people. Try to be as specific and detailed as you can. You do this for places that you saw in the video, objects, actions, and so forth. So you're really remembering this thing in a lot of detail. And we want to see how that impacts the subsequent task. Well, we've got to have something to compare that to. So we've used a variety of control inductions. Probably the best one is what we call the impressions control. So here, this is a within subjects experiment where you're seeing two different videos in two different sessions separated by a week. And for one of them, you'll get the ESI. For the other, you'll get the control induction. And now for the same amount of time as you spend in the ESI, you're asked to describe your general impressions of the video. What were your impressions of the people? Did you like it? When did you think it was made? And we go through a variety of different questions of this kind to hold constant the amount of time you're performing these two inductions. And then we're going to look at performance on subsequent tasks following these two inductions. Again, it's within subject's experiment, typically separated by a week, although we've done it within the same experimental session as well. Everything, of course, counterbalanced. And what we have found, I'm just going to sort of go through a verbal summary here because we've done a lot of work on this, is that ESI selectively boosts the subsequent performance on tasks that we hypothesize recruit episodic retrieval. So importantly, you imagine the future in more episodic detail. Imagine future episodes after you've just had the ESI versus the control induction, and you remember past experiences with more episodic detail, specifically episodic detail, having just had the ESI versus the control induction. We've done work on means and social problem solving. This is where you're given ambiguous social simulations and you have to, situations that involve problems, and you have to come up with an open-ended solution to these problems. We think it draws on a lot of the same kind of episodic retrieval recombination processes that imagining the future does. And indeed, we found that the ESI boosts performance on means-end problem solving. If you just had the ESI, you come up with more effective steps to solving these hypothetical, everyday social problems. And divergent creative thinking. We've now done several studies on that, and I'm going to walk you through one example from a divergent creative thinking study. And in all these cases, we found similar effects regardless of whether ESI is compared with the impressions control I just told you about, or a more neutral control where you just do math problems for the same amount of time that you do in ESI. So let's look at our first study on divergent creative thinking. This is published in Psych Science back in 2015. It was standard young adult study, reasonably small sample. We've replicated this many times, thankfully. You see that video, you get either the ESI or a control induction, and then you get the alternative uses task, which I'll jump into in a minute. That's a standard test of divergent creative thinking, where you have to come up with novel uses of an object, or you get an object association task. That's where you're given the same object cues, but you just generate familiar associates of the object. And then you come back a week later, you see a different version of the video, you get whichever induction you didn't get the first time around, and you do different versions of the AUT and the object association task. So let's look at that alternate uses task for those who are not familiar with it. Here you're generating unusual and creative uses for 5 everyday objects, such as, for example, a coin. Guilford developed this task a little over 60 years ago. So I could give you a word like coin, come up with novel but appropriate uses, and you score it for novel uses, total uses, appropriate uses, whether it could actually work or not. Can't come up with something just crazy that wouldn't work. Category of uses, that's uses that fit under one category. And the standard measure is to combine those two and look at AUT effects in terms of categories of appropriate uses, uses that fit under a single category that are appropriate. That's often referred to as the flexibility measure in AUT. And you can also like score these ideas for originality, for example. And we typically have blind raters score these AUT protocols, and we get very high correlation in terms of what's scored as an appropriate novel use from blind raters. So just to give an example, for categories of appropriate use for coin, using it as a board game piece and as a bingo chip are appropriate uses under one category of games. So we don't want you coming up with, you know, the idea of, oh, you can use a coin as a game chip and then naming 20 different games. You're only getting credit for one category of appropriate use. For shoe, holding an adult in it and holding a big screen TV in it are not going to count because they're not viable uses. For the object association task, the control task here, you're just generating other objects that are typically associated with each of the 5 object cues. We don't think this involves much divergent thinking, episodic imagery, recombination processes, and so on. So for bucket, objects could be mop or sponge, but not cleaning. And here's the overall results replicated within that paper and several times since. If we look over on the right, that's our measure from the AUT, the flexibility measure, category of appropriate uses. After you've just had the specificity induction, you're coming up with significantly more novel but appropriate uses under a single category than after the control induction. And there's no such effect on the object control task if anything goes slightly the other way. So you get an induction by task interaction with the AUT. Now, these behavioral findings for imagining the future, divergent creative thinking, and also means and problem solving led to some predictions regarding brain regions that are targeted by ESI. And so we thought that core network regions that had been previously linked with retrieving episodic details, these are regions that should be influenced when you do a task in the scanner where you imagine the future or you do a divergent creative thinking task, and it's preceded by ESI versus control. And we've now put this in the scanner a couple of different times. So in a 2016 paper, we had people doing the future, just the future imagining task. There's no memory condition in this experiment. So you're given a single word cue, asked to imagine a personal future event, or you're given what we refer to as the object's control task. This is one of several control tasks that we've used in this line of work as a control for imagining the future. So again, you're given a single word cue, but here you're asked to mentally generate what we call a size sentence. So a sentence that includes the cue word, 2 related object words, and you order them mentally in terms of size from biggest to smallest. You also mentally define each word. So it's a pretty taxing task, involves both imagery and semantic processing. And we collected behavioral data after the fact, after they come out of the scanner. And again, we get a selective increase in what are known as internal or episodic details. Internal details, the term from the autobiographical interview I'll talk about in a little bit, on the imagination task. So the ESI was working as it normally does behaviorally. And if you just look at the simple univariate contrast following the ESI and following the control induction, which was kind of a combination of the impressions control and math control that I talked about earlier, you see robust activity through the core network in both conditions. But even eyeballing it, you can see that there are some differences. So following ESI, you get this robust bilateral hippocampal activity, much weaker following the control condition. And you're also seeing some lateral parietal activity that is there for the ESI and not for the control. And so when you do the tighter contrast and you ask what regions that are showing greater activity for imagine versus object are also showing increases for ESI versus control, indeed you get a couple of the predicted regions, the anterior hippocampus, which has been associated with retrieving episodic information in previous studies, is showing an increase following ESI. Inferior parietal lobule also been associated with increased retrieval of episodic detail. And the precuneus, a region that often turns up in kind of strong memory contrasts, showing this increase of activity when you imagine the future having just had the ESI. And we could tell a similar story, not identical, but similar for divergent creative thinking. So we did a very similar kind of study in the scanner published a couple of years ago in cerebral cortex, now examining the impact of ESI on 2 tasks, the alternate uses task, which we have just gone through, and the object association task that we just discussed in the behavioral study. So we're just putting those in the scanner. And if we do that tight contrast now, again, that I just showed you, the key finding is that we get that same left anterior hippocampal regions showing greater activity during the AUT than OUT and following specificity versus control induction. We didn't see the lateral parietal or precuneus regions, but we did get the same anterior hippocampus. Interestingly, we also got a couple of control regions showing increased activity, a couple of dorsolateral and ventrolateral prefrontal regions that are been associated with cognitive control, showing the same increase during the AUT followed by specificity induction. And indeed, a resting state connectivity analysis conducted after the task showed increased activity between that left anterior hippocampal seed and one of the control regions. This was of interest because in a review paper led by Roger Beatty that we published a few years back in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, one of the points we noted as a kind of signature feature almost of divergent creative thinking is interaction between default and control networks. And here we were seeing something like that happening to a greater extent following ESI than the control induction. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about ESI. Now I want to move on to some of the TMS work. And we began on this line of work a few years back in a paper that was led by Preston Thakral, who's led the TMS work in the lab. And this study, published in Journal of Neuroscience, I'll just review very briefly. It was a study in which inhibitory TMS was applied to the left angular gyrus, that's part of the core network, prior to giving people tasks where they were given word cues and either had to imagine a future event, remember a past event, or do a semantic free association test, similar to what I've told you about before. And the angular gyrus has been implicated in episodic retrieval, among other processes as well, certainly not exclusively. But what was found in Preston's study is that when people perform these tasks, ever having just had a TMS to the angular gyrus versus to TMS to a control region, with the idea that that TMS persists for a period of time into the task interval, is that people were imagining future events with fewer episodic details, remembering past events with fewer episodic details, following TMS to the left angular gyrus, but we didn't see any effect of that TMS on a semantic free association task. So again, another kind of a dissociation here where we're seeing an impact of, in this case, TMS to a core network region, specifically on episodic retrieval, and similarly impacting remember the past, imagining the future. Now we know from some important work coming out of Joel Voss's lab, the Wang et al. Science paper in 2014, is that when we apply TMS to the angular gyrus, it's not just impacting the angular gyrus alone, it also impacts regions that are connected to the angular gyrus, including the hippocampus. So their paper showed how you could use TMS to the angular gyrus to downstream, so to speak, impact the hippocampus, a way of using it indirectly to look at hippocampal function. So we used an fMRI-guided TMS approach to this left angular gyrus now to examine the possible causal role of the hippocampus in both episodic simulation, divergent thinking. So we combine TMS, specific TMS protocols similar to what Wang et al. Used with an fMRI scanning study. This is reported just last year in PNAS. So there were separate sessions, and here a slightly different protocol was used, continuous theta burst stimulation, or CTBS, to either the angular gyrus or the vertex control site, just prior to task performance during fMRI scanning. So they weren't getting the TMS in the scanner, they're getting it just before they went in there. And then they do pretty standard tasks of the kind that we've discussed. They're imagining a future event, generating alternate uses, or doing that sentence generation control task that we that we looked at earlier. And the target region was slightly different in every subject. The target region that was stimulated in the angular gyrus, it was identified in a separate initial session based on participant-specific resting state functional connectivity analysis with a hippocampal seed region that we identified that had been previously linked with episodic memory simulation and divergent thinking. So you're asking, for each individual subject, what's the best spot in the angular gyrus to try to hit that is functionally connected to this hippocampal seed region. And then details of imagined experiences are coded the same way that we've coded them in previous studies. I've kind of haven't gone into the details on the scoring, but many of you or some of you will be familiar with the autobiographical interview initially developed by Brian Levine and colleagues back in 2002. And this is a way of breaking down remembered or imagined experiences into what are called internal details. Those are the episodic details. Who was there? What happened? Where did it happen? Core details of the remembered or imagined event. External details are typically related facts, commentary about the event, maybe other events than the target event. These are rated by individuals who are blind to the condition using procedures based on the autobiographical interview. And we also did the AUT, and that was scored as before for fluency, the total number of novel and appropriate uses, and flexibility, categories of novel and appropriate uses. I should mention that we have looked at the originality measure in these studies and never found an impact of ESI in the earlier work on originality. And in this study, we didn't find an impact of TMS on originality, but it's these generative measures, fluency and flexibility, that we're focused on. And here are the main behavioral results. So if you look at the A panel, what we're seeing is pretty much the standard pattern. When you're imagining the future, you get the reduction in internal or episodic details after angular gyrus versus vertex stimulation. This is a replication of the previous study that I talked about. There's no impact in the control task. We devise a scoring scheme to come up with internal and external details when you're generating these sentences. And there's no impact on the control internals, and there's just no impact on external details at all. And then we see a novel extension of the TMS effect now to both the fluency and flexibility measures. You're coming up with fewer novel uses of objects when you've just had this stimulation to the angular gyrus versus the vertex. What happens in the brain? Well, indeed, you see that there are hippocampal regions that show a task by CTBS site, angular gyrus or vertex interaction. So again, there are hippocampal effects during both the simulation tasks following angular gyrus stimulation and the novel uses task, not during the control task. If anything, it goes the other way. So indeed, you are seeing, and it's linked to the behavioral data, a reduction in hippocampal activity when you imagine the future, try to generate novel uses of objects following stimulation of the angular gyrus. So it's an extension of that previous Voss lab work. And resting state of functional connectivity analysis showed that seed to target, that is hippocampal to AG connectivity, decreased after CTBS to the angular gyrus versus the vertex. So it all kind of fits together pretty nicely in this study and shows, again, you can use this TMS to the angular gyrus to indirectly impact the hippocampus. Okay, so that gets us through the work on mechanisms. And my last few minutes, I want to come back to what I talked about at the beginning and talk about episodic recombination and memory errors. So the constructive episodic simulation idea, as I mentioned earlier, holds that the same flexible retrieval recombination processes that serve the adaptive function of constructing novel event representations for a variety of purposes, including future imagining, that support episodic simulation related functions, can also contribute to memory errors when elements of different experiences are miscombined. So I want to finish up by telling you about a couple of experiments that were led by Alexis Carpenter when she was a graduate student in my lab. And here we tested this idea about the involvement of flexible episodic recombination in memory distortion by going to an associative inference paradigm, because we thought it captured some of the key processes that we were interested in looking at. So associative inference, we can think of as an adaptive process that allows us to combine related information acquired in distinct episodes to form novel connections that we haven't directly experienced. So here's an experimental example. I can show you, for example, the man on the left and the construction toy on the right. And separately, I can show you the little boy and the construction toy. And you can put those together at a later time and infer, hey, there's some kind of link between these two because they're both associated with the same object. An everyday example of this would be you go out for a morning walk and you see a man walking a dog on your block. And then the next morning you go out and you're going, let's say, a different route, and you see a woman and that same dog in a different part of your neighborhood. You can make the inference that they are probably living together, husband and wife. They have some sort of relationship because they're both walking the same dog and you see them in different parts of the neighborhood. You can make that associative inference, and people like Ali Preston have done a lot of really important pioneering work on the cognitive neuroscience of associative inference. Our hypothesis was that this capacity for flexible episodic recombination that can support inference across related events could also leave memory prone to error or distortion, such as source misattributions, where details of a related event are mistakenly attributed to memory for the original event. So I'll show you how that plays out in the experimental paradigm. In the everyday example, the question would be, if you successfully infer that the man and the woman are related via this common dog, does that render you more prone to mixing up where you saw the two? Maybe you mix up those two places and you think you saw the woman where you saw the man, or vice versa. That's the question. If you make that inference successfully, does that leave you more prone to mixing up elements of these related episodes? So we used an AB-AC associative inference paradigm to test the hypothesis that the flexible episodic recombination process that's supporting successful inference, that's a good thing, can produce false memories, in this case, source misattribution errors. So how do we do that? So there are two sessions separated by a 24-hour delay, AB encoding and BC encoding. So here you would see that guy in the construction toy that I showed you before, and in a particular context or scene. So think of the important thing to focus on here is that this guy's in a living room with a white couch. Then in a separate block of trials, you're going to see what we call BC images. So that's when the other individual is associated with the same object. He's also in a living room, but now focus on the living room with the brown couch. So during encoding, participants are told, hey, later on, you're gonna see these AB-BC pairs. We're gonna test your memory for what you saw. And oh, by the way, we're also going to ask you about whether people in different images are associated via common objects. So we kind of give away what we're going to ask them about, and we're going to ask you about some of the scene details. We followed the procedures from an earlier paper from Preston that didn't look at memory, but that looked at associative inference. So there are two sessions separated by a 24-hour delay. In session one, you're getting AB and BC encoding. So a lot of these person, object, context scenes, and you get the AB scenes and people and objects first, and then you do a separate BC block, and then you come back 24 hours later, and first we give you a memory test for source details. We're going to ask you about exactly where something happened. Then we're going to give you the test of whether you learned the object association and also the inference. Do you know that the man and the boy are associated, are linked via that common object? And then this is the critical manipulation. Then afterwards, we're going to give you another source detail test on some of the other items. And what we're really interested in here is the impact of making that associative inference on source memory. So we're going to be comparing source memory errors from before and after the associative inference test. So this is an example of what the source memory test would look like. Remember now that you saw this guy with the construction toy in the room with the white couch. So if we ask you what was the color of the couch, white would be the correct answer. Red would be the misinformation answer, if you will. If you're now the brown couch with the red circle, where you're saying, oh yeah, I remember this guy. He was in a room with a brown couch. That's obviously a source memory error. Then what we're interested in is the question of, are you more likely to mix up those contexts after you've just made a successful associative inference versus an unsuccessful one? So the associative inference task is one in which we're going to show you that person, and we're going to ask you, was he linked via a common object to this little boy or that little boy? Obviously, it was this little boy. And of course, we have to make sure that you learn the direct association as well as a kind of control. So was this guy associated with this object or that object? But this is what we're really interested in. So following the inference and directly learned trials, participants complete the second half of the source detail questions, as I just showed you. And here are the hypotheses. If this episodic recombination that we hypothesize can lead you to make this successful inference also increases susceptibility to false memories, then the proportion of source misattribution should be higher when you just made a correct inference than an incorrect inference, but only when the source test is given after the inference test. So if it's the act of pulling together these two, the man and the boy, to make a correct inference that produces a memory error, then you should see a boost in memory mistakes after you've given the inference test, but not before. And this is the slide that pretty much captures the critical results. So what I'm showing you here is the proportion of false memories. So that would be the proportion of times a subject is claiming to remember, for example, that the man holding the toy, that they saw that man in a room with a brown couch. And as you can see, when we're looking at that second source memory test given after you've just had the chance to do the associative inference, when you've made a correct inference, when you were right that the man is associated with the boy, you're more likely to mix up those two contexts. You're more likely to claim incorrectly that the guy was holding the toy in a room with a brown couch after you've just made the correct inference. When we give you the source memory test before taking the inference test, then there's no difference in the proportion of false memories for items for which you later make a correct versus a correct inference. So the critical thing really is it's this manipulation of giving you the inference test that bumps up memory errors for correct inference. And I'm not going to have time to go into it, but we replicated this 3 times within this paper under different experimental conditions. I will finish up just with one more study because I think it's such a nice result. And that is an Fmri study where we try to get at this question of why does episodic recombination resulting in successful inference produce source memory errors? When people make a correct inference about the relationship between elements of these events that haven't been experienced together previously, we argue they might more fully recombine the details from the 2 episodes when you make that correct inference, and details from one episode may be more likely to migrate to and become incorporated in the related episode. We think it supports a key idea of the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis that I told you about before, that this flexible recombination can support the construction of a novel event representations and also increase memory errors. So, final bit of data I'll show you from a recent Fmri study. All the details are in the recently a neuroimage paper that just came out. So the hypothesis here is that this flexible episodic recombination mechanisms that support successful associative inference result in mistaken binding, I've shown you that, of source details across event boundaries. And here we want to see whether that's evidenced by neural reinstatement of misbound details during subsequent retrieval attempts. Can we see evidence of a neural signature that, for example, memory or an image of the brown couch is coming to mind when they make the associative inference correctly and make the memory judgment incorrectly? So to put that in a slightly different way, do neural patterns during retrieval of source or contextual details on the test that I showed you that follow successful inference become more similar to the overlapping but incorrect context compared to after unsuccessful inference? So we use this, we address this using a MVPA, multivoxel representational similarity analysis, multivoxel pattern analysis. And I'll just give you a brief overview of the methods. The key thing here that's added is that there's a pre-exposure phase where we're just trying to get some estimate of the multivoxel pattern associated with each of the background scenes that are going to show up in the main experiment. So again, let's focus on that living room with the brown couch. We're going to try to get a measure of the response in various regions of interest that I'll tell you about in a minute when there's no person or object in the room. So we have some estimate of what the neural response in these regions to these context or background scenes is prior to the experiment. Then you do AB and BC encoding outside the scanner just as before. You're going to see the guy in the holding the construction toy in the room with the white couch, the little boy room with the brown couch. And the setup is really the same experiment as I told you about before, because now 24 hours later, you're going to do all these tasks in the scanner. It's kind of a long session, but people hang in there. You're going to be asked about source details for half the items. Was it a brown, was the guy in the room with a brown couch or a white couch? Then you do the directly learned and associative inference trials where we see the impact of associative inference. And then you do the other half of the source memory questions. So if we just conceptually what's going on here, what we're interested in is the question, when this guy has in mind the room with the brown couch, can we see evidence of that multivoxel pattern for the context that we get from the initial session, the response without anybody in the room? And the way we're going to do that is by implementing what we call a match-mismatch approach. This is taken from some earlier work from Wing and colleagues, and we've used it in some other experiments. We're going to try to look at the correlation between the multivoxel pattern in this scene during the source detail test with the previously established multivoxel pattern in the pre-exposure phase. How correlated are those two? That we're going to call that R match. And then we're going to compare that to how correlated this pattern is to all the other patterns in the experiment. And we're going to look at the difference between match and mismatch as an index of reinstatement of this pattern from the pre-exposure if R match is greater than R mismatch. And what we want to see is R greater than R mismatch when they make this mistake, when they claim that, hey, I remember the item with the brown couch. Do we see evidence of neural restatement of that room, and is it greater after they've just made a successful associative inference? We focused on 3 ROIs based on previous research. The anterior hippocampus and posterior medial prefrontal cortex have been consistently implicated by previous studies in successful associative inference and memory recombination and integration. And the left inferior temporal gyrus has been consistently implicated by previous studies in reinstatement of contextual details relevant to our paradigm. And this is really the main result. There are a lot of other results from this study, but I won't have time to go into them today. What we can see is that when we're looking at our match versus our mismatch, and that's what I'm plotting here on the y-axis. So the higher this bar goes, the more evidence there is of reinstating that particular neural pattern that we're interested in. And as you can see, what we're looking at here is that there's more evidence of this false, what we call false pattern similarity, after you've made a successful inference than an unsuccessful inference. In all 3 regions, you see that that difference. Whereas when we're looking at this same contrast before, when you're making the memory judgment before we give you the inference test, then there's no difference in false pattern similarity. So what seems to be going on is you've just made that correct inference, and now you make the memory mistake. There's more evidence that you're basically reinstating some memory of the brown couch when you're incorrectly claiming, after you've made the correct inference, that, hey, that guy was in a room with a brown couch. And no pattern is like this is observed in control regions that we looked at: posterior hippocampus, anterior VMPFC. So it's not something that's just happening willy-nilly all over the brain. It seems to be pretty specific to these 3 ROIs. At least it wasn't happening in these control regions where we had no basis for expecting it to happen. Okay, so I think these fMRI data provide support for this flexible recombination, constructive episodic simulation idea. And in given the evidence that divergent creative thinking recruits flexible retrieval and recombination processes, we hypothesize that divergent thinking may also be linked to memory distortion. I'm just going to skip through this because I know I'm short on time, but basically we have in fact found evidence of an association between memory distortion in the well-known DRM paradigm and divergent creative thinking on the AUT. But if anyone wants details, I'll go back over that. But I know I'm short on time, so I just want to go to the conclusion that episodic recombination processes that support adaptive processes that we've looked at here, associative inference and divergent thinking, also produce memory errors, source confusions, and then in the thing that I just blew through very quickly, false recall and false recognition. Okay, I want to come back to Bartlett to conclude, and I think that his quote, "Remembering is not the re-excitation of innumerable fixed, lifeless, and fragmentary traces. It's an imaginative reconstruction or construction." I think that all the evidence I've talked about today really fits with this idea, really that originates with Bartlett, that we need to think about memory as an imaginative reconstruction. It does a lot of good work for us, but its basis as a constructive process also occasionally gets us into trouble. And I want to acknowledge my lab, collaborators, funding sources, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very, very much. That was splendid. Let's have a couple of questions. We usually give precedence to students, so maybe if you're a student and you want to ask a question, maybe unmute yourself and ask a question. I also have a couple, but we can wait.
Yes, I have a question.
Hi.
First of all, thank you. It was a great talk and a very interesting one. I was wondered if there is an effect of the current environment or the current context of on those processes on retrieve memory and imagine future event. So, for example, if I ask you about a former event in specific circumstances, would you recall it differently if I ask you in a different circumstances?
It probably depends what you mean. I would say in general, probably yes, but what you mean by different circumstances? What do you have in mind?
Different sensory input or different social, you know.
Well, there is a lot of work that under the rubric of retrospective bias, I talk about this a lot in the 7 Sins of Memory book, that is all about the general point you're making, how your present knowledge, present circumstances, present beliefs can retrospectively impact memory. And there are studies that show that properties of a cue can also impact exactly how you remember a past event. We did some work years ago with Kevin Oxner making that point. We haven't specifically looked at that in the context of this line of work or in scanning studies, but I think it is it's an interesting direction for future studies to look at and underexplored.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Anyone else?
Hi, Professor Schacter. First, thank you for this fascinating talk. And second, maybe it's a bit more specific than the last question, because we did some experiment like in a course last year based on your work and based on the autobiographical interview of Levine, and we tried to find a relation between an experience which is like self-related to like more detailed mental imagery or like more vivid mental imagery. And like we showed the subject a video where we first told them like they are the main character of the video, so that they will feel like more related to them, and then we told them like to relate from other perspective, like they are the director of the video or other other person like in the video, to see that the more self-related experience would create like more detailed vivid imagination or like retrieval. And like we didn't come up with those results, but I still have this thought that self-relation might be important. Do you have any thought about?
Yeah, it's an interesting. You would think that there would be some measure on which you might be able to detect that. It might not, if I'm understanding what you said correctly, and in the sort of the other condition, you're going through the video as if you were a director. You might be extracting a lot of the same things, not identical, obviously,
yeah.
As you would in the self condition, but you know, for certain purposes that might not make a difference, and it might be that you have to come up with a very subtle measure related to self processing or evaluation or something like that to pick up the difference between those two things. But it's an interesting experiment.
It's not something you tried like to think which memories are more vivid or which cause like higher mental imagery, or
we haven't really done that
okay.
as part of this work. No.
Okay.
Thanks. Then I'll just ask a quick question, if you don't mind. So your studies with Carpenter and the one with a toy tractor and the last one you alluded to seem to connect. I haven't made this connection in the past. So you seem to connect DRM / associative spread activation with source amnesia, like the good old studies with 2 lists. So here you use 2 sins. Have you elaborated? I'm not familiar with the specific papers. Have you elaborated on this possible connection between these 2 effects of source amnesia and DRM?
Let's see. Depends exactly what you mean by that, because with DRM is a form. You could call that a form of, semantic activation induced source amnesia or source confusion, where you're getting mixed up about, was that did I hear that word at study, or did I just produce a lot of semantic activation related to that word? And as I mentioned, again, in this paper that just came out in Cognition, the thing I blew through at the end, we did see a pretty consistent link between propensity to DRM, false recall and recognition, and increased divergent thinking creativity score on the alternate uses task. In terms of the relationship between DRM and maybe another measure of source memory, maybe like the measure that we used in the associative inference task, we haven't specifically looked at that. There has been, however, a literature that continues to evolve on the question of how related are these different kinds of memory errors or false memories. So is there one general, is somebody who's going to be more likely to falsely recognize an item in the DRM? Are they also more susceptible to a misinformation effect, to other kinds of source memory errors? And I'd say the literature is a bit mixed, but the recent studies, most recent evidence would suggest that the answer to that question is no, that there's not one single dimension that you could say we're all on, that we're going to show more or less susceptibility to different kinds of, source amnesia, DRM, misinformation, even though there are some studies where some of those are linked, but the most recent evidence suggests that there's got to be something in common, but there are also important differences. But that's another underexplored but important area.
Intriguing. Thank you. Okay, thanks again, Dan. We appreciate it, and I hope we didn't wake up Emily.
I think she's still sleeping, as far as I can tell.
That's good. So Happy New Year, and say hi to Sue for me, please.
I will.
Take care.
Happy New Year. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.